Right. So as far as ADM principles itself is concerned, as I discussed with you in the earlier session about the business architecture part, information systems architecture. At the same time, we have even discussed about technical infrastructure architecture, right? So that part was discussed, like what was the purpose behind that, followed by this, what are the inputs to be given into an account, right? So to get some output, right? So all these things we have discussed in the earlier session. So the major role, especially at the same time, the major understanding over the enterprise architecture level, if we want to understand, is about the architecture vision. So that major focus we have to perform on architecture vision, right? So this is what generally we are going to discuss the inputs relating to the architecture vision part. So architecture is a vision document which normally, because of course there were templates which usually we get. There are different templates for architecture vision when we prepare. Depends on the organization to organization. All these things will vary, right? So irrespective of the kind of model are we going to, right? So because some people may use traditional models of application development. Some people may be using agile model, all that, but end of the day, architecture vision document is something essentially important when we are going to implement Togaf framework from the context of ADM, because as far as architectural development method itself is concerned, if you want to implement Togaf, the understanding over architecture vision is something essentially important. Now, if we want to prepare an architectural vision document, so this is again, I'm repeating, this is with the consent of technical team, right? So this is with the consent of business stakeholders team. All that architecture vision document is something essentially important uh, for us to understand and to prepare with, because this will give you a roadmap towards reaching the final goal of the business. What is that we want to achieve in? So there are some points we need to understand, because when you want to prepare an architectural visual document, what are the points to be taken into an account is what something we are going to discuss in today's session. So the first point is to define the problem. At the same time, we need to identify the change drivers. This is the first thing which we have to mention when we are working on, whenever we are working on architectural vision. So if there is any architecture vision document we need to develop, first of all, we need to define the problem, because defining the problem, business problem, is what something we need to understand. So if you want to understand the business problem, subsequently to know about the business need, understanding the business situation is what something we need to know, right? Let's say, for example, let me take the same example as we have taken earlier, right? So let's say there was a retail store where we want to understand the problem, right? So problem which customer is facing as of now, right? So assume that customer is facing a problem in two areas. One is about the performance of the systems. This is where they were facing problem. Second, centralization of data, okay? Because these are the two major problems, assume that they were facing. Now, what is that we need to do? If you want to define the problem, the very first thing you need to understand the business situation. Let's say if there is a system performance is an issue, right, which user is facing, what usually it leads to? It leads to delay of the transactions or the activities which they are performing at the time of billing, right? So that people have to stand on queue for a very long time, right? So the business situation might be in such a way, more than the shopping time, whatever the time happening for billing is more, for example, right? So this was the situation which you need to understand. So what were the driving force behind having this lag is what something we need to understand from the problem perspective. Right? So this is where generally whenever we try to understand about or when we try to develop the architecture vision document, so we need to define the uh, business problem on that. Right. So now when we want to define the business problem, we need to understand the context of the business because situation or the context which customer is in now. At the same time, we need to identify what are the change drivers which impacts when we are developing solution for the customer because we need to identify what are the different change drivers followed by the kind of opportunities, right? So because if you want to develop any solution for the customer, we need to identify the right opportunities to do that because what must be the targeted architecture we need to identify, right? So because if you have taken this into an account, the billing system or the billing cycle is what something is getting affected due to this reason, right? So the major problem here is the billing cycle because whatever the billing structure or the cycle which organization is performing at this time is what something being affected due to this. So we need to understand the area of the situation which customer is facing the problem. So what are the change drivers we have to be focused more on, right? So change drivers is to streamline the billing cycle or the billing process. Enhancing the billing process is what something which provides solution for the existing situation which customer is in. Now, if you study about the billing cycle or a billing process, we need to identify who are involved in it, right? So we need to understand who are users in that, who are active users using that billing, who is involving in the billing process. And the reason behind performing this billing, right? So the reason performance billing is to generate sales, right? So ultimate reason was that, ultimate conclusion was that we need to know. So for that, what are the systems are we using? What are the different systems are we using here? Because there are different infrastructure systems we use, like billings, a point of sale system is being used. It's not only about the point of sale system, but also it is also important for us to understand about how this point of sale system is connected with other systems. Let's say that it was connected with inventory management system, right? So which is usually a dependency. So as long as if you have not identified the dependency of correcting something if it is required in the inventory management system, how well the solution you have given for the existing problem in context to the point of sale system doesn't have any value of it. So if you want to correct the billing system or the cycle, we need to identify the users who are directly involving in it. So what and how they are performing. So for that, what are the supported infrastructure and applications they were using? To what extent are they performing earlier as of now, earlier as well as now? What could be the possible dependencies which impacts the performance of the existing application? Because what is the dependency here? Inventory is a dependency, right? So as long as inventory system was identified, as long as inventory management system was accurate. So if it was the updated data was there in the inventory management system, billing will be much easier. Assume that the inventory management system was not so accurate. For example, there was no updated data available, right? So there was no proper maintenance over the inventory management system, wherein by grading the products, right? So using different inventory control techniques we use, something like ABC analysis, two-bin system, right? So different using that inventory controlling and inventory management techniques is what something in backend operations team has to perform. Assume that it was not happening properly. What will happen now? Ultimately, it impacts on the result. What a billing person has to be performed on front ground, right? So these are the major aspects, so which we have to be identified, right? So these are the change drivers which could impact the performance of the system because of the billing, what is happening here, right? So when we want to develop an architectural visual document, this is all something we need to understand about the problem. What was the background of the problem? Why was it arised? Is it just because of the performance of the application which they were using since ages, long time? Or is due to the or else is it due to the lack of ability of a person who is performing the billing? For example, if the person is an individual is not so well in performing billing, right? So that could be also one of the reason behind that, right? So the problem background we need to understand. At the same time, what are the change drivers which we have to be focused more on? So based on that, we will be knowing about what are the opportunities behind this uh, by understanding about the target architecture and all everything, so that addressing the business problem will be much easier for us to improve the performance to the next level. So this is the first thing which we have to be which we have to write whenever we are creating the architectural vision document. The second point, we need to identify the high level architectural objectives, right? So we need to understand, as well as we need to identify the high level architectural objectives, right? So because these objectives, right? So these objectives may be a long-term objectives. These objectives may be a short-term objectives, because long-term objectives, which will focuses more on the vision which they wants to achieve in future. So long-term objectives will streamline the activities of the business performance, which is happening inside of the organization, right? So we need to identify the high-level architectural objectives, which majorly we need to focus on few things. So one is about, we must be knowing about the business objective, right? So what could be the business objective which we wants to solve, right? So because these business objectives are also connected with technical objectives also. Let's say business objective is to uh, complete billing process within the limited timeline, right? So this is what the business objective is. One of the business objective is to complete the billing process as earliest, as faster as you can, so that within short time we can perform 100 more sales we can do. This is an objective. But if you want to drive towards the objective, we need to understand the technical objective as well. This is where generally we call it as technology objective also, right? So for that, to reach that, what kind of technical objective we want to achieve, right? So what kind of technology is something essentially required, right? Because is it, so for that we need to have a understanding over the existing process or the business activity or a business process. Was it, what is that it was going on, right? So we must be knowing about the technical specification of the existing application or the design which organization is using. So that sort of understanding is what something we focus more on the business objective perspective. Next, we need to know about the business requirements, right? So the business requirements, uh, nothing but all that, right? So because goal, vision, right? So what was the existing process, right? So we need to know about the business requirements from the high level point of view by reaching the goal and vision. What is that they wants to achieve finally? This is where generally business requirements come into picture. This was discussed a couple of times in the last session, so that I'm not going into, you know that. Next, we need to understand about the concept of solution from the visual representation point of view. Because what kind of solution is something customer is expecting from us? Because is this solution we are going to develop must be an on-premise solution or it's a cloud solution. Okay, these are the two things. Of course, nowadays we are moving towards cloud. Okay, that is undisputed fact. That's the reason why AWS, Azure, right? So all these are coming into picture due to that reason. But when it comes to the on-premise application and all, again, we have to see the dependencies, because for the cloud application, you don't may not be required to see the dependencies within the application. Maybe there can be an external dependencies. They may not be an internal dependencies to perform with. But when we are going to develop in on-premise application and all, for sure, we need to have a complete understanding over the internal dependencies, because what are the different systems and applications or the infrastructure which is interconnected with this, right? So that sort of understanding, that sort of idea is something which we must be having, so that it is more convenient for us to provide a solution concept, right? So concept of solution for the customer, what they wants to achieve, right? Is it something viable to develop an on-premise solution for the customer, or else is this viable for us to develop a cloud application to the customer? Because cloud application to the customer, again, if you want to identify an on-premise application, how other applications were dependent or interdependent with this. And if you are making any changes in the existing one, how it is impacting on the other areas, other functionalities of the applications which are dependent in it, that we have to study. Let's say, for example, when we are working on the cloud application, let's say that, right? So we are working on the cloud solutions where we are developing cloud solutions for the customer, right? So for example, this is our conclusion we are making, right? So when it comes to the solution part is concerned, cloud application requires infrastructure which will be provided by the cloud service provider, of course, software and as well as platform. Whatever is needed, we redo it. But end of the day, what is needed? This is not something individual on its own, it is working. End of the day, this must be integrated with other external systems. This is where, if you see sometimes, right? So this is where general integration come into picture. For example, we are working on AWS application, right? So using AWS solution cloud services, you are using an application. But when we are using an application, what is that we see? Sometimes we need to access the customer data, right? So we must be knowing about the perception of the customer. So what customer is expecting, right? So what are customer expectations? Everything we have to know. So if we want to know about all these, what is that we needed? First of all, we should understand how, in what way we have to integrate this with other CRM applications. Let's say organization is using an Salesforce CRM or Dynamic CRM within the organization to manage customer expectations, all that. So what we have to make sure, the cloud application or the solution we are developing must be interconnected with the CRM application and how to integrate with CRM application, right? So how to access the server to extract the information, whatever is needed for us. Or else it can be an ERP, right? So because ERP application, either it can be SAP or something like that. So because this ERP applications where we are integrating with modules, what are the different modules we have involved? So we are integrating with all these modules. This is also something which we have to be focused more, right? So when we are trying to provide a solution based concept of solution, when we are trying to develop and all, this sort of understanding is something essentially required. So this is also one of the key element which we have to be focused more on. Next, the third one, we need to identify the stakeholders. This is also something important. Identify the stakeholders and their concerns. This is also required. So whenever we try to understand about the stakeholders identification of the stakeholders. I think in the last sessions, I have discussed that. So because we use power and interest grid, this is the technique which normally we use to identify the stakeholders, because stakeholders can be anyone, right? So either these stakeholders can be an external stakeholders, these stakeholders can be an internal stakeholders. So identification of stakeholders is what something we have to do or we have to perform, right? So this is where, yeah, stakeholder management process. This is where generally stakeholder management process come into picture, right? So this is where we have to see, right? So what kind of stakeholders are we having? These stakeholders can be an external stakeholders we may have, right? So we may have different internal stakeholders also. So when we want to identify the stakeholder, there is a matrix, there is a technique which normally we use called power and interest grid. So identification of stakeholders, power and interest grid is what something we use initially to start with. Means if you want to manage the stakeholders and as well as the process in regular intervals, because we need to know about their expectations, demands, perceptions, right? So what could be their limitations, right? So we want to know that. First of all, we need to identify the stakeholders. Power is what something we are taking into consideration, because power leads to decision making. People who are involving in decision making, whose decision making impacts on the project, those people has to be considered first. Second, we need to know the not only power. Second, we need to know about the interest. Interest leads to involvement, right? So in what way people are interested here, right? So who are involving in the project in day-to-day activities, right? It can be technical team, it can be development team, right? So user interface design team, it can be testing team, so it can be database professionals, it can be architect team, arts, right? So these are the people who will be involving in the project on day-to-day motion, right? So this is where interest come into picture. Interest leads to involvement. So stakeholder identification is what something we have to be performed initially. So again, this will be categorized. We categorize this into 4 different directions, like high power, high interested people comes under the first category. Business people, business owners, technical owners, at the same time, project management team, even we as an architects, at the same time, business analyst team, right? So these people are comes under high power, high interested category, because these people have a decision making authority, because these people can impact the project by implementing or by 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 showing their decision or by saying their decision. At the same time, in reference to the environment will also be more to them, right? This is one category. Second, high power, low interested category, because these people have a decision making authority, but in reference to the implementation perspective, as interest perspective and all everything was very less, because these people may have external stakeholders, maybe shareholders who has invested money in the organization. So end of the day, what was the return normally they see is only return of investment, right? So what they have invested in the organization, what is that finally they wants to get out of it, right? That's what generally the focus they'll be doing. So these comes under the second category, high power, low interested people. Power, as far as power is concerned, high. As far as interest itself is concerned, low, right? So this is point number 2. Next, low power, high interested people. Low power, high interested people means people who doesn't have power in terms of decision making. Either it can be a technical team, like developer team, IT, testing team, right? So user interface designers or database design team. These people may not be involving in the decision front or decision side. But in reference to the involvement will be higher, because end of the day implementation, whatever the changes are we making in the existing project, implementation subsequently will be done by them, right? So they are the one who normally develops, right? So who will be developing solution and all everything is they, right? So their concern, their expectations, their constraints, all these things, technical constraints, I mean to say, all these things has to be taken into consideration. This is the third category. Fourth category, low power, low interest rate, we call it as. Means these people either not having power or not having interest. It's other stakeholders. It can be sometimes, I'm not saying all the time, sometimes it can be some functional heads or someone, or maybe external stakeholders, if any. So all these people are comes under low power, low interest rate category. This is how generally stakeholder identification is what something we have to do if you want to manage your stakeholders. So once we have identified the stakeholders, the next is what we need to analyze and manage stakeholders. This is what you can see over here. Either it can be business domain expert teams, or it can be end user side, right? So here I have divided this into three different parts, right? So you can see, yeah. So first of all, end user side, right? So who are the users who are going to use this application? So once we have delivered this application and all that, who are going to use this in the organization level? So either it can be direct impacted people, right? In context to the point of sale system as I have taken, right? So billing team, inventory management team, it can be store management team, right? So these people, or as database team who is managing the data, all that, or as business domain experts, right? So these are one category, right? So these are one category when we talk about stakeholders. Second category, project organization team. It's a project or project organization or project management team, people who are involving in the project in terms of the implementation. I can say, right? So technical specialist means all the uh, implementation team, like technical team, like development team, testing team, all that, right? So this is all people will be involved in it. At the same time, even functional experts, like people who design the business process, right? So these functional experts will also be in this in this segment. Third one about system operations team, right? So who are responsible to manage the systems and as well as operations on day-to-day activity. So these are all people initially will be considered called as stakeholders. This is one category. Above than that, there are people who are management level, right? So maybe uh, upper management level, I can say, right? So because either it can be HR team or it can be a program management office, right? So because program management will be there, because one is project management, about that program management. Project management majorly deals with a particular project and how are we managing it, right? So either it can be budget, it can be manpower, it can be scope, right? It can be work breakdown structure. All these are comes under project management. But when it comes to the program management, nothing but group of projects, because this is where generally program management come into picture. Means what are the multiple projects we are working on. So this is where generally program management come into picture, because these people will interact with multiple projects. These people are not someone confined only for a particular project. Program management team involves in multiple projects within the organization. Right? So if you see any organization, we have different accounts, right? So we may have accounts, some people accounts maybe belongs to banking sector, right? Some people may be from insurance domain, some people may be from healthcare, some people may be from retailing. Multiple accounts we manage, multiple accounts we in regular intervals we manage in the organization. So for every account, there will be a structure of development team, right? So application development team will be there, support team will be there, deployment team and all, right? So to manage all these multiple projects and all, there will be a program management office, PMO. It's not project management office. I'm talking about program management office, PMO, program management office, who manages all the multiple projects which are working within the organization. So these are all people will be there. At the same time, even QA and as well as standard groups, because depends on the organization to organization. Sometimes, because let's say, for example, some organizations wants to implement CMM level in their organizations in each and every stage of the business activity they are performing, right? So there will be some lead auditors to implement and to see whether it is implementing right or not. There will be some people who works as called lead auditors, right? So lead auditors who audit whether is this whatever the standards we have initiated so far is being implemented. These people, based on that, necessary certification will be provided by this lead auditing team, because these are the people who audit the process whether they are following the right standards and procedures. Based on the necessary certification will be given for that organization, either it can be CMM level, Six Sigma, all that, right? So these are all comes under the standard groups, irrespective of the kind of hierarchy they were into. At the same time, procurement team, HR team, right? So enterprise security, all these are comes under the core functions. These people are also called as stakeholders, because again, as I told you in the beginning, so identification may vary, right? So classification we may do, right? So because some people may be in the first category, high power, high interested category. Some people may falls under the second category, high power, low interested. Some people may be in the third category, low power, high interested category. Some people may be in the last category, low power, low interested, right? It can be, right? It may happen. But end of the day, corporate function groups is also these people. At the same time, external people may be some regulatory bodies, right? Let's say we are implementing some healthcare applications. Okay, so when you are implementing in healthcare application, whatever the external bodies like HIPAA regulatory bodies there, right? So they will be taking care of all that. Or else, like from our context, from an Indian Bharat context, if you see external bodies, let's say if you are taken insurance, right? So insurance domain we are working on. External regulatory bodies may be IRDA, right? So if it is banking and all, it can be RBI. It can be financial institutions and all everything, stock market and all. It can be SEBI, right? So regulatory bodies are the external people, because external people who is supporting or who is impacting on the decisions, what is that we have taken to implement any solution and all. Of course, these people are not directly involving in the project, but their influences, their decisions, whatever the government body has taken a decision has to be implemented when we are working on the applications and the systems. So that process, that rules book, which we have to follow, right? So if you are not following that rule book, uh, mm, if you are not following that rule book, these applications and as well as systems will not be considered as valid, right? So that's what it was. So that's the reason why these are all the stakeholders which we have to be identified based on four categories which I have said, right? So all these things are comes under, yeah. So all these things are comes under this identification of stakeholders and their concerns, followed by this analysis and management. So if you want to analyze and manage the stakeholders and all, there will be a matrix which normally we use called RACI matrix. Means who is responsible, who is accountable, right? So whose support is required, to whom we need to consult, to whom we need to inform, right? So this is what generally we call it as RACI, stands for RACI matrix. So this RACI matrix depends on the kind of tasks we are performing. Let's say, for example, we wants to change the requirements in between. Let's say, for example, customer has given the requirements wherein we are working on. Now, all of a sudden, there are some changes happens in the requirements in mid of the project due to the uh, business changes happens in the organization. They wants to add some new requirements to the existing project, or they wants to change the existing requirements, either anything of that. Now, if you want to change the requirements and all, we need to see who is responsible for that, right? So if there are any changes happens and all, who is responsible for that? Who is accountable, right? So to who's, because when people have responsibility, it leads to accountability, vice versa. Who is accountable? They held responsible. Responsibility and accountability usually will be in one line. Then at the same time, like whose support to be taken. Let's say, for example, if there are any changes to be taken into existing application, you need to consider architect level, right? So those level, hierarchical level, we have to consider architects and all. At the same time, technical team, because when we have identified the scope, when we have defined the scope for any of the project, whenever we are working on, If there are any changes happens in the implementation of the requirements and all in the project level, so it deviates the scope of the project, which may sometimes increases the complexity when we are working on. So hence, what is that we have to see? We have to see, we need to have support and consultation of technical team also, because at the end of the day, implementation will be formed by them. At the same time, we need to inform this to the subject matter experts or someone, or maybe for shareholders and all. Right, so that's how generally RACI matrix is what something we use. Means who is responsible for what, who is accountable for what, whose support is required for us to implement this, to whom we have to consult to take decision before prior. At the same time, to whom we have to inform before we are going to take a decision out of this. This is where generally stakeholder analysis and management come into picture, irrespective of the kind of tasks we are performing. Either this task may be uh, this task may be uh, a requirement level task, right? Or is these tasks may be relating to the infrastructure of the project, or it can be enterprise, it can be security related thing, or it can be budget, or it can be timeline. So in the middle of the project, I mean to say, right, may not be in the beginning. In middle of the project, there are changes happens, right? So this is where again, this is where we call it as architectural change management. If you remember, when I explained you about ADM cycle in the beginning of the session, I told you, right? Architectural change management, which I have told you, right? So, what changes are what changes are happening in the requirement? Subsequently, those changes will be impacted on the architecture because it's a technical roadmap we are developing end of the day that impacts on the architecture also subsequently. So, this is where generally identification of stakeholders followed by the kind of concerns what they have and all everything is also something which we have to be focused more on, right? So this is also one of the key and prominent element which we have to be focused more, right? So when we are working on the this one, sorry, 1 minute, just give me, please. Yeah, thank you. Right, so this is where generally this identification of stakeholders followed by the kind of concerns what they have, right? So all these things we have to consider. Next, the fourth point, we need to understand about the project constraints, right? So we have to confirm the project constraints. Confirm, right? So confirm project constraints will also be taken into consideration. So constraints can be anything, right? So because again, this can be categorized into four different categories. It can be a budget constraint for us, because budget can be a constraint sometimes, because there will be some limited budget which was given by the customer, a standard budget, ensuring us we have to complete solution within the limited budget. Otherwise, it landed end of the day it landed into a loss, right? So this is where we call it as cost failure project, because project is completed successfully or about to complete successfully, but it's a cost failure project, cost overrun, right? So it may leads to that, right? So project constraints, this is where generally budget come into picture. Next, at the same time, technical constraint, right? So because this is also one of the key element, right? So what technical constraints do we have? Again, this we discussed earlier also, right? So it can be on-premise. What could be the possible constraints we have in terms of the technology? Assume that the application was developed in .NET way back in long back. Now we want to implement Java, for example. Okay, so as far as the security of the application, we want to develop security features and all that. So we have identified Java is the right choice, for example. Right? So Java, we want to implement Java now, right? So now when it comes to the implementation, we see the environment which was built at the client location was on .NET. Now we are transforming from .NET to Java. This can be a technical constraint. Right? So wherein customer has to change their environment, whatever the environment requires and all. Customer has to change the requirement right from the scratch. So for that, they have to, again, it is somewhere connected even to the budget, right? So the budget and necessary training post implementation of the project, necessary training to be provided to all the people who are involving in it, right? So this is all something which comes under the technical constraints. Next, operational constraints, right? What are the operational difficulties we have identified? What kind of operational difficulties we have identified so far, right? So while we are working on the application, what are the operational difficulties? All that. Next is regulatory constraint, right? So because depends on the kind of policies, procedures, standards, whatever we have discussed, because here you can see, right? So regulatory bodies are there. So when there are regulatory bodies who are implementing and working on the project, end of the day, there are some regulatory standards, policies, and procedures which we have to be focused more on. So this is where generally this project constraints and all everything were coming into picture. So these are the major areas we have to be focused when we are working on the architectural vision document. So there was a template, of course, I'll be showing you so that you get some idea over that, right? This is the template which normally for architectural vision document, whatever you can see is all about architectural vision document here. This is, so of course, table of contents, TOC and all everything, you know that, right? So this is where generally the first one about the document information, which we have to be updated first, right? So information about the document is what something we have to be mentioned, right? What project are we doing, right? So who is going to prepare this? At the same time, reviewed by whom? At the same time, what was the version? Because let's say the project we are doing first of its kind, right? So it's the first version. Maybe in future we are adding some new features and functionalities to the existing application. This may go to the second version of the project, right? So version may change, but basic structure of the application, what are the features and functionalities which are required remains constant. But rest of the things will be changed. It depends on the business need, what is required, all that. So this is all something comes under the document information. Next, distribution list means distribution list majorly focusing on the hierarchical process of the document distribution happening from one to another. So how this document we are transforming from one to another and all that, right? How are we sharing this document to the required stakeholders in regular intervals and all, to whom are we sending, right? So let's say this hierarchical process, if you have taken, let's started with this with the for example, this with from the higher management side, right? So maybe from it can be from maybe from CTO, for example, right? So technical chief technical team officer, right? So it was there, assume that, for example, right? So what was the hierarchical process from where it will go on to? Because this document has to be reached to the developer level, right? So developer level, when we are going to provide solution for the project, this architectural vision document should be reaches to the developer level. So what are the different layers are there in between, right? So what action we are taking? For example, technical architects, if you have taken or given this to the technical architect team and all, they'll be focusing more on the technical perspective of the project, infrastructure, etc., all that. So if you have given this to the data architects and all, so the kind of action items, what they were performing, majorly relating to the data related perspective, right? So what kind of database management system we have to implement? So how the data flow process, right? So what type of data we are taking? Is it a structured or unstructured data, right? So all these things, from where we have to extract the data, right? So what kind of data warehousing tools we want to use, what are the different data mining techniques we have to implement to extract the data and all that. So this is all somewhere, the distribution list is what something we have to be mentioned. But point to be noted when we are talking about architectural vision document, whoever are related and relevant in the hierarchical process is what something we have to be focused in the distribution list. Next is document revision version history. You know that, right? So because what are the versions are we? Because initially to start with, we don't see any versions. But over a period of time, when we are working on the document again and again and all, versions may change, right? So changes and all, everything will be happens. Next, this is about the purpose of the vision document. Of course, this is all powered by Togaf only. This is the document which I have taken, right? So purpose of the document, right? So for what purpose the document are we going to prepare, right? So why is it are we going to create on a high level note, etc. All these. Next, we need to write down the problem description. As some time back, I have discussed about this part. So well in advance. The problem description, as some time back I have told you. Next, about stakeholders and their concerns, right? What that was discussed even some time back with you. Next, what are the list of issues and scenarios to be addressed, right? So this list of issues or the scenarios or the problems can be anything. So it can be from the application point of view, right? It can be performance issues, right? It can be scalability, it can be security, it can be functional, it can be non-functional, anything, right? Scalability, all that. So this is all something, the issues which we have to be addressed here. So for that, what are the business vision statement? We have to be focused more to design the target architecture, right? So all these things are comes under the 2.2. The next we need to focus more on the vision document because business vision statement is what something we want to know, right? So business vision statement followed by the business vision document, right? So what they wants to achieve in near days. That's where generally this business vision document or statement or a document or a diagram, which we have to be prepared. This is also one of the key element. Next, about change drivers and opportunities. What are the areas which we have to be focused more on? What are the change drivers which impacts the decision, right? So because let's say inventory management is one of the dependency here, right? So this is one of the change driver we have to be focused more on. At the same time, what are the opportunities we have which can leverage to the next level? This is all something comes under the change drivers and opportunities, all that. So next about the detailing objectives, right? So we need to know about business objectives and as well as technical objectives. Sometime back, which I have discussed with you so far and all that. Next, this is about the environment process model, right? So we must be knowing about what are the different business processes which are involving in reaching to the vision of the project we wants to achieve, right? So there can be multiple business processes which are involved, and these business processes and all everything was interconnected. This is where generally we need to know that. At the same time, the important point is about information flow, right? So how this information flow happens in between among different processes and all that. So how this information flow happens. This is where generally data architecture come into picture. Data architecture or data architects majorly focuses on the information flow, how it is transforming from one system to another system and all. So again, we have to see the scalability, we have to see the performance, and we need to consider the load balancing as well, right? So how, if there is at the same time, we have to make sure and create a system in such a way, it must be having a fault tolerance, because if there is any problem arised in the existing component or something, it shouldn't be impacted on the other application. The reason why we are moving towards microservices architecture due to that, right? So those are the environment process models we need to mention under the Togaf vision document. Next, process description, whatever the process we are following and all that. So that process description should also be mentioned in this process document, all that. Next, what are the process steps mapped to the environment? So this is also needed, right? So because how the process we are initiating, so that has to be mapped with multiple business functionalities which were happening inside of the application when we are developing, right? So that part even we have to mention, right? So this is where generally process mapping come into picture. Different diagrams we prepare, because in the last session also I told you, right? So we have UML diagrams. Of course, in UML itself we have lot many, right? Those are all were there. Or else process mapping, because there are different tools like Visual Paradigm, Enterprise Architect, right? So there are different tools like Lucid Charts. There are a lot of tools nowadays are available to prepare business process mapping, right? So business process mapping diagrams and all we have to prepare. So visual representation is what something we have to be focused, because end of the day that matters a lot, right? So even though we are preparing this architectural vision document, all that, but end of the day, but end of the day, how we are building the process mapping diagram for a particular business problem, what we have identified towards going towards the solution. So how this business process mapping we are creating, this is where something essentially required. So for that, what kind of tools are we going to use and all of the thing may be different. So that, because I'll see mostly lucid charts and visual paradigm. These are two which can be available online. Because so using this can be done. Even rational or star human can be used, or visual. So of course we have a lot of tools, right? So to use that, right? So this is all something comes under the process steps, and how are this we are mapping with the process and as well as the people. So how the information flow is transforming from one system to another system and all that. Next, what are the different actors who are involving in it? Because this is where, when I discussed in the beginning, if I told you, right? So when you are going to provide a solution for any business problem, first of all, we need to identify the beneficiaries. Who is going to get benefited out of this solution? If you are giving a solution, who are the beneficiaries? Okay. So those beneficiaries may be, it can be people who are directly uh, involving in the user perspective. Let's say billing people, or it can be store managers, it can be inventory people, it can be HR team, all that. Human, I can say. Or else it can be systems, it can be servers and all that, right? So who are the actors who are involving in it, and what are their roles and responsibilities in reference to the implementation usage of the application? As for example, as in when we are developing a cloud-based point of sale system in reality, who are users, who are going to use this application, and what could be their roles and responsibilities? So actors need not be people, right? So it need not be humans. It can be system also, right? It can be system. Even for example, server, right? So server is based on the information or based on the input we have given. Server has given you an reply to you, right? So even server is also, a system is also called as an actor. The reason why, when we are preparing use case diagram, you can see, right? So when you are going to prepare an use case diagram, even system or a server, finally where we are accessing the data, right? So that also we are considering as an actor here, right? So because when you prepare use case diagrams and all, you will be knowing all that. Use case diagram, which give you a clear understanding about the primary actors and how these primary actors were connecting one among all, right? So for that, generally use case diagram we prepare. So majorly there it will be more involved, right? So human. Next, again, the detailed description over the human actors and roles who are involving in it, and what are their roles and responsibilities. At the same time, requirements. So what are the requirements? Either it can be business requirements, it can be stakeholder or end user requirements, it can be solution requirements, what we are developing now. It can be transition. Transition means where we are transitioning from an existing state to the proposed state now. This is where general transition requirements come into it. Or else it can be a regulatory requirements also. What are the regulatory standards, procedures we have to be taken into account? That's all comes in the required regulatory requirements. Followed by this, we need to resulting in architectural model, right? So we need to develop an architectural model. So in when we are developing this architectural model and all, what are the possible constraints which you have to be addressed? This also I have discussed with you sometime back. And what are the IT principles we have to be followed, right? So because organization to organization, while we are implementing the systems or when we are using the systems and all, what are the IT principles we have to be focused more on that? At the same time, what are the supporting process when we are developing the architecture system, right? So either it can be high level initially, because that's where last time I told you, right? So high level designs is what something we have to know first. The next we go for low level designs. High level designs give you a high level view of the application, what is that we wants to develop all that. Low level design, this is where generally even what data structures are we using, right? What algorithms are we using? All these things are comes under the low level design part. This is where generally these design patterns and all everything we use. Because especially again, these design patterns, this depends on the kind of architecture we are developing. For example, if you are using microservices architecture and all, different design patterns we use, circuit breaker, or else event-driven architecture, or else service registry, or else CQRS model. Okay, these are all the different architectural design patterns, right? So because depends on the microservices architecture, what are the design patterns we are going to use and all. So all these things are comes under the low-level design part, because whenever we are preparing low-level designs and all, so it depends on that what architecture are we developing. So for that architecture, when we are implementing microservices architecture, what design patterns are we addressing? Circuit breaker pattern we use, right? So for example, if there is uh, any problem was impacted on a particular component and all, that circuit breaker will be implemented where it won't be affected in the other components. This is where it was. So at the same time, CQRS model will be there, right? So query model, at the same time, communication model, all that. At the same time, event-driven architecture will be there, right? So these are the different design patterns will be used in the low-level design part, because in high-level designs, we don't use it. When it comes to the low-level design and all, yes, design patterns we have to implement it. Right? That comes next, right? So when I'm discussing about the solution architecture of that is Togaf, there we are going to discuss about all that. Okay, I'm going to discuss that because as I told you in the last session also, today and tomorrow I'm going to cover the Togaf part. Then again, I'll go back to the solution architecture in continuation. I told you that in the last session, if you remember. So this is where generally the IT principles and all that comes. Next, architecture supporting process. At the same time, required mapping architecture. So these are the different things which will be taken into, which we are going to prepare when it comes to the architectural vision document, when we are preparing, especially when we are implementing ADM and all everything in Togaf enterprise framework. Is it clear? Kalai and Ranjit.